Brunei Bay, The Roll Call of the Living, October 27, 1944. Brunei Bay, northern Borneo. Dawn crawls over the water like a bruise turning yellow, and the anchorage smells of oil. Heavy, sweet, and wrong, as if the sea itself has been wounded. A thin rain taps the steel decks in a steady, indifferent rhythm, while launches weave between hulks and silhouettes. Destroyers riding low, cruisers with their paint blistered, and men standing at rails with faces that look older than their ranks. Lieutenant Commander Matsuoka, Operations Section, a staff officer on loan to what's left of Kurita's force, steps from a small motor launch onto a ladder slick with spray and soot. The metal is cold through his gloves. Above him, a sentry's voice cracks in the damp air. Tojo! Attention. The salute is crisp, almost defiant, but the ship beneath it is not. It vibrates with the weary thrum of damaged machinery, and somewhere inside, a pump labors like a failing heart. He climbs, boots ringing hollow, and as he reaches the deck, the first thing he sees is a line of sailors crouched around a torn canvas sheet. Beneath it are shapes that do not move. Someone has weighted the corners with shell casings so the wind won't lift the dead into view. A petty officer murmurs without looking up. They came back with us, as if that should be enough. Matsuoka forces his eyes forward. He has orders, cold, clerical orders, to account for ships, aircraft, personnel, ammunition expenditure, to turn 4 days of fire and confusion into columns of ink. A young ensign meets him near the bridge, uniform still damp, cap stained with rust where a fragment tore through yesterday. Sir, we've received fragmentary signals, the ensign says, voice carefully neutral. Fragmentary. It's the word they use when the truth arrives in pieces too sharp to hold. Matsuoka takes the signal slips anyway. He reads them in the shadow of a gun turret whose blast-blackened muzzle points uselessly toward the mangroves. Musashi. Sunk. He stares at the characters, thinking of the giant battleship's hull, the pride of Kure, swallowing in the Sibuyan Sea under repeated air attack. American carrier aircraft coming in waves, their engines a rising howl that never seemed to end. Another slip. Atago. Sunk. Maya. Sunk. He tastes copper in his mouth, though he hasn't bitten his tongue. Chokai. Lost. Zuikaku. Sunk. That one hits differently. Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor's strike force, gone off Cape Engaño with Ozawa's decoy carriers, sacrificed to draw the Americans north. Decoy. A word so thin it can't cover the weight of what it means. They had sent carriers to sea as bait, because they no longer had the aircrews to fight like carriers. In the bay, the proof sits all around him, not in grand speeches, but in the empty flight decks that will never again be crowded with trained pilots, in the tired hands that patch shrapnel holes with whatever steel they can cut, in the whispers about fuel rationing that follow every order like a shadow. On the bridge, an exhausted captain with reddened eyes points toward the far side of the anchorage where another ship lies with her bow low, damage control crews still running hoses. We're here, the captain says, and it is not pride, it is disbelief. Matsuoka looks out across the bay and realizes the anchorage is not a gathering of victory, but a refuge for survivors. Each ship a partial sentence trailing off, each wake a thin line leading back to a battlefield that has already devoured the words, decisive battle. The dream had been simple. Draw the American fleet into Philippine waters, smash it with surface guns, and turn the tide. But the sea has answered with arithmetic. Ships lost faster than steel can be laid. Pilots gone faster than boys can be trained. Fuel disappearing faster than oil fields can be held. And here, in Brunei, the silence between the engines and the rain is filled with a new kind of fear. Not that they will be defeated in one great blow, but that they are bleeding out, drop by drop, with no transfusion left to give. Matsuoka is still on the bridge when the first proper report arrives, an encoded dispatch relayed from Manila, its paper damp at the edges as if it too has crossed the bay by launch. A signalman reads it aloud in the clipped cadence of procedure, but the words refuse to stay procedural. Enemy landings at Leyte confirmed, surface engagement concluded, our forces withdrawing. Withdrawing. Matsuoka watches the captain's jaw tighten around the mouthpiece of a speaking tube. Outside, the rain thins into mist, and the anchorage's outlines sharpen. Lines of ships anchored farther apart than doctrine would like, as if even steel has begun to distrust proximity. Down on the deck, sailors move with the jerky care of men who have learned that any sudden motion can reopen a wound. Matsuoka takes the dispatch and moves to the chart table, where grease pencil marks still show the old dream. Arrows converging on Leyte Gulf, the plan like a clenched fist. Shogo 1, the decisive battle plan. He remembers the briefings in Tokyo, the language polished to a shine. We shall annihilate the enemy invasion fleet. We shall restore the initiative. The words had sounded like steel. Now they feel like paper. Another officer arrives, Captain Nakamura, staff from 2nd Fleet, his uniform pressed, but his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Kurita is alive, Nakamura says first, as if that alone must be said. He returned through San Bernardino. We passed through their transports. Matsuoka looks up sharply. Passed through? Nakamura hesitates, the pause full of gunfire. At Samar, we engaged escort carriers, destroyers. They fought like madmen, their small ships charged as if they were battleships. He swallows, and Matsuoka hears in the swallow the unspoken shock. The Americans had not run. We could have broken into Leyte Gulf, Nakamura continues, voice lower now, but the formation, the air attacks, the confusion. Admiral Kurita ordered withdrawal. The word falls between them like a spent casing. Withdrawal again. Matsuoka feels a strange heat rise behind his eyes, not anger at Kurita. He has seen enough of the bay to understand what exhaustion does to decisions, but a dawning comprehension of the trap they have sprung on themselves. They had wanted a single, clean engagement where gunnery would decide fate. Instead, the battle has been a storm of separate violences, bombs falling in the Sibuyan Sea, torpedoes in Surigao Strait, desperate surface action off Samar, and carrier air power everywhere like an invisible ceiling. An aide brings more slips, names, numbers, positions, each one a small hammer. At Surigao, Nishimura's southern force has been shattered, battleships caught in an American crossfire, torpedoes and radar-directed salvos turning night into a killing field. In the Sibuyan, Musashi has been beaten down from the sky by repeated strikes, her anti-aircraft guns blazing until they are silent. And to the north, Ozawa's carriers, Zuikaku among them, have been emptied of seasoned aircrew and sent as decoys, their sacrifice acknowledged in the cold phrasing of staff work. Matsuoka runs his finger along the inked lines of the chart, and the realization is not a single dramatic flash, but an accumulation of weight. Even when Japanese ships reach the enemy, even when individual captains fight bravely, the battle is no longer theirs to shape. The Americans see at night with radar, they strike at range with carriers. They can replace losses with industrial calm, and above all, they can keep their fleet fueled. Fuel. Always fuel. Matsuoka has sat through logistics briefings where officers spoke of economy runs and reduced training sorties, of battleships that can barely steam without draining reserves meant for the decisive moment. Leyte was supposed to be that moment, and yet, here they are, engines idling in Brunei, counting the dead and the missing while the enemy holds the initiative and the Philippines burns. A gust of wind pushes mist across the anchorage, and for a second the ships look like ghosts, present, real, but already receding into memory. Matsuoka folds the dispatches carefully, a habit of order in a world that has lost it. And he hears himself ask in a voice he doesn't recognize, "How many pilots returned?" Nakamura doesn't answer immediately. When he does, it is almost a whisper. "Not enough." The answer, "not enough," follows Matsuoka off the bridge and down into the ship's interior like a drifting smoke. He finds himself in a cramped compartment lit by red-shaded bulbs, where the air is warm and smells of damp wool, machine oil, and iodine. A chalkboard lists damage control watches and casualty figures in neat strokes that try to make tragedy legible. Here, among the staff and the surviving aviators shuttled between commands, the battle returns not as maps, but as sound. The distant, remembered roar of engines, the hard slap of bombs on water, the rattle of anti-aircraft fire that never seems to end. An aviation petty officer, older than his rank suggests, face pitted by sun and salt, sits on a bench with his hands wrapped around a tin cup. His name tag reads Sato. He stares into the tea as if it contains the Sibuyan Sea. Matsuoka, careful not to intrude, asks the simplest question he can. "Where were you?" Sato's eyes lift slowly. "Sibuyan," he says. October 24th. The date lands with the precision of a log entry, but the memory behind it is raw. He speaks in short bursts, as if each sentence costs air. "We heard the warning first, distant, like thunder. Then the lookout shouted. Black specks, growing. American carrier planes." Matsuoka can almost see it. The grey sea, the Japanese center force pushing west under a hazy sky, the great silhouettes of Yamato and Musashi like floating fortresses, and then the sudden transformation of the air into a weapon. Sato's fingers tighten on the cup. "They came in waves," he continues. "First the bombers, then torpedo planes low over the water. We fired until the barrels glowed. The sky, it was full." He swallows. "Musashi took hits early. You could hear it even over our own guns, the strikes on her armor like hammer blows on a shrine bell." A staff officer nearby mutters, half to himself, "She was built to fight battleships." Sato's mouth twists, not quite a smile. "She fought the sky." He describes the torpedoes as white scars on the water, their wakes arrowing toward the battleship's hull. When they struck, the ship lurched, enormous and wounded, yet still maintaining formation as if sheer discipline could hold the sea at bay. The anti-aircraft guns barked, the tracers stitching upward, and still the planes kept coming. "We saw one helldiver burning," Sato says, naming the American dive bomber with the grudging accuracy of a man who has studied his enemy's tools. "It fell into the sea and the smoke lay on the water. Another plane came right through it. They didn't stop." Matsuoka listens, and in his mind the staff briefings of decisive battle dissolve into this: a man looking up into an endless ceiling of aircraft that Japan can no longer match. He remembers the quiet admissions from training commands: flight hours reduced, fuel scarce, replacement pilots rush through syllabi that once took years. In theory, a battleship can absorb punishment and keep fighting. In practice, in 1944, punishment comes from above, and it comes repeatedly, precisely, from carriers that can launch strike after strike without exposing themselves to gunfire. Sato's voice drops. "Musashi slowed. Her bow dug into the sea like she was tired. We saw men on her deck still firing, still, even when she listed." He closes his eyes briefly, and when he opens them, the wetness is not from the humidity. When she finally went, it was slow, like a mountain sinking. Around them, someone turns a crank radio, and the speaker crackles with distant voices, but no one listens. The real broadcast is Sato's description: human scale, intimate, and devastating. A ship that embodied Japan's industrial pride being dismantled, not by another battleship's guns, but by relentless air power and attrition. Matsuoka thinks of the numbers he will have to write. How many aircraft attacked? How many torpedoes hit? How many bombs penetrated? How many men were lost? Yet the numbers are only the shadow. The substance is the shift in war's grammar. Steel can no longer dictate the terms. The sky now writes the sentences, and Japan's ink, fuel, trained aircrews, carriers with intact decks and functioning air groups is running out. Sato finally lowers his cup and looks at Matsuoka with a bluntness that is almost permission. "Sir," he says, "we can still fight, but we can't keep losing like this." The compartment is quiet for a heartbeat, and in that quiet, Matsuoka feels the truth settle heavier than any report. Leyte was not simply a battle. It was a demonstration of how Japan is being bled, ship by ship, pilot by pilot, until bravery itself cannot fill the tanks or rebuild the flight decks. The next morning, October 28, 1944, Matsuoka is sent by launch to a different ship, an older heavy cruiser with patched plating and a bridge wrapped in makeshift splinter screens. The sea between hulls is littered with oily sheen and stray debris, the quiet aftermath of frantic repairs. On board, the mood is different from the previous vessel, less stunned, more grimly analytical. Here the talk is of the southern approaches, of Surigao Strait, where the war's future arrived in the dark. In a wardroom that smells of wet paper and stale tobacco, Commander Hayashi, gunnery officer, voice hoarse, unrolls a chart with hands still bearing black smudges from smoke and powder. He doesn't begin with heroics. He begins with the time. October 25th, he says, after midnight. Surigao. He taps the narrow throat of water on the chart. A funnel. His finger lingers as if warning the paper. Nishimura's force went in. Battleships Yamashiro, Fuso, cruisers, destroyers. We believed we would strike the invasion fleet from the south while Kurita came from the north. He looks up. But the Americans were waiting. Waiting. Another word that carries a new meaning in 1944. Not waiting with eyes, but with antennas and cathode ray screens. Hayashi gestures toward the darkened corner of the wardroom, where a young officer, thin and pale, sits quietly. Our liaison from communications intercepted fragments afterward, Hayashi says. They tracked the approach with radar. They knew positions in the night, as if it were noon. Matsuoka has heard radar discussed with a mix of contempt and unease, sometimes dismissed as a gimmick, sometimes feared as sorcery. Hearing it here, in the mouth of a gunnery officer who has watched ships die, strips it of mystery and leaves only the practical horror. The enemy can see you when you cannot see him. Hayashi continues, and the story becomes a sequence of invisible blows. First, American PT boats at the strait's mouth, darting like insects, harassing and reporting. Then destroyers slipping in to launch torpedoes, long steel fish cutting through black water. The torpedoes came first, Hayashi says, and Matsuoka imagines the sudden white streaks, the shouted warnings, the desperate turns in confined water. Fuso is hit and breaks, burning, her silhouette splitting in the night. Yamashiro keeps coming, because doctrine demands it, because there is nowhere else to go, because the plan insists that if you push forward hard enough, the decisive battle will happen by force of will. Then the American battle line opens fire, and the night belongs to them. Hayashi's voice tightens. They cross the T, he says, using the old gunnery phrase like a curse. They were already aligned. Their salvos came in measured intervals. You could see the flashes, far, steady, like a row of lighthouses. Matsuoka can picture it. Japanese ships groping in darkness, gunfire blind and scattered, while the Americans, guided by radar, deliver accurate, crushing volleys from beyond visual range. It is not simply defeat. It is asymmetry made lethal. A junior officer, barely more than a boy, blurts, "We fired back, of course we fired back." Hayashi nods once, sharply. Yes, they fired back. They died firing back. But the sea does not care about courage when the enemy owns the night. The words hang, and Matsuoka feels them slot into the larger pattern forming in his mind. Sibuyan showed air power's grinding superiority. Surigao shows technology and coordination turning darkness into a weapon. And all of it points to an enemy whose resources allow him to learn and adapt faster than Japan can replace what is lost. Hayashi leans closer, lowering his voice as if speaking in the presence of the dead. "We lost not just ships," he says. "We lost cohesion. The kind you can't rebuild quickly. Formations scattered, signals confused, commanders dead, survivors too few to carry the lessons forward." Matsuoka thinks of the decisive battle dream again, a single clash that would restore balance. Surigao was decisive in a different way. It demonstrated that old tactics and splendid steel cannot overcome a system, radar-directed fire control, disciplined destroyer screens, coordinated fleet operations, that Japan cannot match at scale anymore. Outside the wardroom, a bell rings for a watch change, ordinary as any day at sea. But inside, Matsuoka watches Hayashi roll the chart back up, and he understands that every roll of paper is also a rolling up of options. When you lose ships, you lose steel. When you lose trained crews and experienced officers, you lose time. When you lose time, you lose the war in slow motion. The night of Surigao Strait did not end Japan's navy in one blow, but it revealed, with merciless clarity, that the bleeding is internal now, and no amount of bravery can cauterize a wound made of fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and a technological gap that widens with every passing month. October 29th, 1944. The anchorage is louder today. Engines turning over, anchors being weighed, boats ferrying men and documents as if bureaucracy itself is trying to outrun disaster. Matsuoka is summoned aboard a flagship auxiliary where surviving staff officers from the center force are gathering to compile a coherent narrative of what happened off Samar. The room they use is cramped, its bulkheads lined with charts and signal logs, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the sour tang of sweat that no amount of naval discipline can fully erase. A large map of the Philippines dominates the table, Leyte and Samar ringed in grease pencil circles. Someone has written 25th of October in bold strokes near the eastern coast of Samar, as if labeling a wound. Captain Nakamura is there again, and with him a younger officer, Lieutenant Morita, who had been on the bridge during the engagement. Morita's uniform is immaculate, but his hands betray him. When he reaches for a pencil, his fingers twitch with remembered adrenaline. "We came out of San Bernardino at first light," Morita begins, voice clipped, professional. "Sea state moderate, visibility good. We expected to find the invasion transports in Leyte Gulf." He points to the map, tracing Kurita's route south. "Instead we found..." He pauses, searching for the right term, as if even now he's embarrassed by it. "Escort carriers, small ones." The room makes a soft, involuntary sound, half scoff, half disbelief, because the hierarchy of naval war has rules, and one of them is that battleships do not waste time on small ones. Yet Morita's eyes are flat. "They were carriers," he says simply, "and they had aircraft." That is the pivot, not size, but function. He describes how the first American planes appeared overhead, not in neat planned strike formations, but in desperate piecemeal attacks. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, anything that could carry ordnance. "They came down through clouds and rain squalls," Morita says. "Dropping bombs, rockets, some dropped depth charges." A bitter chuckle moves through the officers. Depth charges, anti-submarine weapons, used against cruisers and battleships because the pilots had nothing else. "They were not effective individually," Morita admits, "but there were many, and they kept coming." Matsuoka watches the map and feels the geometry of the moment. Kurita's heavy ships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, the cruisers, moving toward what they believed was the soft belly of the invasion fleet, only to collide with a swarm that refused to behave like prey. Morita's pencil taps another point on the map. Destroyers. Destroyer escorts. They charged us. The word charge is spoken with a kind of reluctant respect. They made smoke, Morita continues. They fired torpedoes at close range. Some came so near we could see men at their guns. A senior officer interrupts, incredulous despite himself. They attacked battleships? Morita nods once. Yes, as if they had no choice. In that room, you can feel the shift from tactical recounting to something more personal. The Japanese officers, trained to believe in weight of fire and decisive engagement, confronted by an enemy willing to throw light ships into the jaws of heavy guns to buy time. Morita describes the American destroyer Johnston, her silhouette appearing through smoke, guns flashing, charging straight at the cruisers. He describes another, Hoel, closing the range until torpedoes could be launched, taking hits that tore her apart, yet still fighting. Their shells were small, Morita says, but their intent was not. The line hangs, and Matsuoka understands. Intent can change the tempo of battle, even when the metal is thin. Then comes the confusion. Kurita's formation scattered by smoke, rain squalls, frantic maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, air attacks striking from multiple directions, signals misread, ships engaging targets they were not meant to engage. Cruisers breaking off and rejoining like confused predators in a storm. Morita's voice tightens. We sank some, he says. We damaged others, but... He stops again. The but is the heart of it. But we were being hit constantly from the air. Our cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, were slowed, then finished. The destroyers were burning fuel we could not replace. And we did not know where the main American carriers were. We believed they might appear at any moment. Matsuoka sees it clearly now. Even when Japan's battleships achieved contact, even when their guns could have torn apart the vulnerable escort carriers and then moved toward Leyte Gulf, the battle environment, air power, smoke, radar reports, the looming threat of American carriers, created a fog of uncertainty that punished every minute of hesitation. And hesitation, in a fleet already short on fuel and trained crews, is not a pause. It is hemorrhage. Morita finally says the part that everyone in the room has been circling. Admiral Kurita ordered withdrawal. The words fall like a weight onto the table. No one challenges them. They all know what it means, a moment where the old dream might have been forced into reality. And yet the system around them would not allow it to be seized cleanly. The Americans had not needed to win by sinking Yamato. They only needed to deny Japan the ability to deliver a decisive blow. Off Samar, a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, ships the Japanese would have once dismissed, had helped do exactly that. Matsuoka looks at the map, at the circled date, and realizes that bravery was present on both sides, but only one side could afford to spend it. Japan's navy, once an instrument of sudden, lethal strikes, is now expending irreplaceable capital, ships, pilots, fuel, experienced officers, just to keep the dream alive for another week. October 30th, 1944. The weather clears for the first time in days, and under a pale sun, the anchorage looks almost peaceful, until you notice how many flight decks are absent, how many masts have been cut down, how many men walk with bandaged heads or missing arms. Matsuoka is ordered to attend a briefing aboard a staff transport where survivors from Ozawa's northern force have arrived, men who smell of smoke and salt, their uniforms still carrying the faint, persistent tang of aviation fuel. In a makeshift briefing room, a large portrait of the emperor hangs above a table strewn with maps of the Philippine Sea and the waters off Cape Engaño. The irony is not spoken aloud. Maps of carrier warfare laid out beneath the gaze of tradition, while Japan's carrier arm is being reduced to memory. Rear Admiral's aide Lieutenant Fujita begins with formalities, but his voice cracks on the first hard fact. Zuikaku is lost, he says, and the room tightens. Suikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor strike carriers, sunk on October 25th. Matsuoka watches the faces around him and sees something like a funeral held in silence. Fujita continues, listing the others: Suiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, names that once suggested aviation decks, hangars, and air groups. Now they are coordinates and times, written in the cold shorthand of signals. He points to the northern edge of the map. Our mission, he says carefully, was to draw the enemy's fast carriers away from Leyte. Draw them away. Decoy. The words are spoken as if they are ordinary tactical vocabulary, but Matsuoka hears the bitterness underneath. A carrier is a carrier because of what it carries: trained pilots, aircraft, the ability to strike beyond the horizon. A carrier without an air group is a shell. And Japan, by late 1944, has too many shells. Fujita confirms it with a detail that makes the room feel smaller. We sailed with a limited air complement, he admits. Limited is a polite word for hollow. The experienced pilots, those who had survived the grinding attrition from the Solomons through the Marianas, are gone, buried in the sea or burned in cockpit wreckage. Their replacements are brave but green, trained on shortened syllabi because fuel is scarce and time is scarcer. Matsuoka remembers the training reports. Flight hours cut, carrier deck practice reduced, instructors themselves lost to combat. Here in Ozawa's recounting, the consequence becomes explicit. The Northern Forces carriers were not expected to win. They were expected to die loudly enough that the Americans would turn their heads. Fujita describes the moment the American carrier planes arrived over Cape Engaño, waves of aircraft so dense that the sky darkened with moving dots. Their strikes were organized, he says, voice low. They attacked from multiple directions. Dive bombers from high altitude, torpedo planes skimming the sea. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired until the air shook with the sound, but the attackers pressed in with the calm confidence of men backed by depth, by more carriers, more pilots, more fuel, more replacement aircraft waiting on decks. A survivor, Chief Petty Officer Ishikawa, interrupts with a sudden raw memory. We watched them coming, he blurts, and we knew we couldn't stop them. We could only endure. Endure. That is what the Imperial Navy has been reduced to, enduring strikes rather than delivering them. Fujita nods grimly and continues. Zukaku's flight deck becomes a landscape of fire. Bomb hits tear through the deck planking. Torpedoes rip open her side. Men fight the fires with hoses and buckets, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes narrowed against the heat. The ship listed, Fujita says. We attempted counter-flooding. He points to the map again, to a spot that now might as well be a grave marker. She capsized. The room is silent except for the faint hum of a ventilation fan. Matsuoka thinks of Zuikaku at Pearl Harbor, young, lethal, carrying veteran pilots who believed in the myth of sudden victory. Now she is gone, sacrificed as part of a plan that acknowledged, implicitly, painfully, that Japan's carrier force no longer exists as a decisive weapon. It exists as a lure, a symbol to be spent. When the briefing ends, Matsuoka steps outside onto the transport's deck. The sun is brighter now, glinting off calm water, and in the distance a destroyer sends a thin plume of smoke into the sky. He watches it and thinks about how modern naval power is not measured only by the tonnage afloat, but by the invisible reservoirs behind it. Fuel in tanks, aircraft in depots, trained crews cycling through squadrons, the institutional memory that allows fleets to fight cohesively under pressure. Leyte revealed that Japan's reservoirs are drying. The battle did not simply sink ships, it consumed the last coherent hope that a single decisive engagement could reset the war. The carriers sent as bait at Cape Engaño prove it. When you are forced to sacrifice your icons just to redirect the enemy's attention, you are no longer shaping events. You are reacting to them, bleeding strategically with every tactical move. October 31st, 1944. In a tin-roofed office ashore at Brunei, hot, humid, and buzzing with insects that seem to worship the lamplight, Matsuoka finally sees the battle reduced to what it has always been underneath: a ledger. The desk is covered in forms stained by sweat and fingerprints, and the air smells of paper, kerosene, and damp earth. A naval supply captain, Kanda, sits behind the desk with his sleeves rolled up, his collar unbuttoned in quiet defeat of regulation. He doesn't offer tea, he offers numbers. This, Kanda says, tapping a column with his pencil, is what Leyte cost us that no communique will ever admit. Matsuoka leans in. The figures are not casualty lists or ship losses. They are fuel allocations. Tons of heavy oil, daily consumption rates, reserves remaining, projected sorties possible. Kanda's pencil moves like a scalpel. Congo and Haruna burn this much just to steam and maneuver, he says. Destroyers even worse proportionally. The zigzags to evade air attack, the high-speed dashes, it drains tanks. He looks up, eyes red-rimmed. And every hour we spend at sea now is paid for twice, once in fuel and again in wear we cannot repair. Matsuoka feels the truth in that second payment. Steel fatigues. Turbines wear down. Bearings fail. Boilers need parts that must be shipped through waters where American submarines hunt like sharks. There is a war on the surface and a war beneath it. The war of logistics, of replacement rates, of what the factories can produce and what the tankers can deliver. Leyte has exposed the gap between what Japan's admirals plan and what Japan's economy can sustain. Kanda flips a page, and the paper crackles like dry leaves. Training allocations, he says. Pilot training. Matsuoka sees the numbers, and his stomach tightens. Flight hours are listed in stark reductions. Programs cut to conserve aviation fuel. Carrier qualification landings abbreviated. Advanced gunnery and navigation hours reduced. Kanda says it without drama. We are producing pilots faster than we are producing pilots, he corrects himself, then huffs out a humorless breath. No, we are producing men with wings, not pilots. Matsuoka thinks of Sato's voice. They kept coming, and understands that the American carrier pilot pipeline is not a trick of talent but a machine. Fuel, trainers, safe airfields, standardized curricula, instructors rotated home to teach. Japan's machine is breaking down. Kanda points to a line item for tankers and shipping. Submarines, he says simply. Every month, we lose more. Each tanker sunk is not just a ship lost, but hours of flight training never flown, destroyer screens that cannot steam, carriers that cannot sortie. It is strangulation measured in barrels. Outside, a truck backfires and the sound makes both men flinch, as if the office itself has learned to expect explosions. Matsuoka's mind returns to the old doctrine, Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. The doctrine assumed fleets could concentrate, sortie, and fight at full strength when the moment came. But concentration requires fuel, sorties require fuel, sustained operations require fuel. And Japan's fuel is not merely scarce. It is precarious, vulnerable to interdiction, and now being consumed in desperate piecemeal efforts to respond to American landings across a widening front. The Philippines, Kanda says, as if reading Matsuoka's thoughts. If we lose the Philippines, we lose the route. He does not need to specify the route from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the home islands. Without it, the Navy becomes a museum fleet, beautiful hulls tied to piers, unable to move. Matsuoka looks down again at the ledger and sees Leyte's true aftermath. Not only ships sunk, but the acceleration of a collapse that was already underway. Every loss at Leyte compounds future weakness. A sunk cruiser is not just metal at the bottom. It is experienced gunnery crews gone, a command staff dispersed, a training cadre eliminated, a maintenance cycle broken. And even the ships that survived came back damaged and hungry, their fuel tanks lower, their crews exhausted. Kanda closes the folder and rests his hands on it as if sealing a coffin. "You can still order a fleet to sea," he says quietly, "but you cannot order oil to appear." In that moment, Matsuoka understands that Japan's navy is bleeding out through invisible arteries, through fuel convoys, through training programs, through maintenance schedules shattered by constant emergency. Leyte did not create these problems, but it forced them into the open. The decisive battle dream required a single moment of maximum strength. Leyte demanded sustained strength over days and across hundreds of miles, under air attack, under submarine threat, under radar-guided guns. Japan could still produce acts of bravery, plenty of them, but the ledger shows the brutal arithmetic. The resources that make bravery effective are disappearing faster than they can be replaced. November 1st, 1944. The heat breaks overnight, and the morning comes in cooler air that carries the smell of wet jungle and diesel exhaust. Matsuoka is directed to a low, windowed building near the pier, an improvised ready room where surviving naval aviators are being processed, reassigned, or simply counted. The room is crowded with men in flight suits and faded uniforms, some barefoot, some still wearing life vests stained with salt. Their faces are a collage of exhaustion, hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that flick constantly toward the door as if expecting another sortie order, another alarm, another wave of Hellcats overhead. A chalkboard on the wall lists squadron numbers and aircraft types: Zeros, Judies, Jills, names that once carried confidence, now written like relics. A lieutenant with an aviator's tan line across his forehead, name tag Kobayashi, stands near the board holding a clipboard. He speaks to Matsuoka with the careful politeness of a man who has learned that rank doesn't stop shrapnel. "We have 37, Kobayashi says, from the last transfers. Some are from land bases, some from carriers, some are not fit to fly." Matsuoka looks around and realizes "not fit" is a generous phrase. One young pilot sits with his back against the wall staring at nothing, hands trembling slightly, as if still gripping a control stick. Another has a bandaged ear and dried blood on his collar. They are alive, but they have been used hard. Matsuoka asks the question that matters most now, the question he didn't know how to ask before Leyte. "How many are carrier qualified?" Kobayashi's mouth tightens. "Very few," he says. "And even those—" He stops, then continues in a lower voice. "We have not had enough deck training. Fuel." There it is again. Fuel as the hidden hand shaping everything. Matsuoka remembers the ledger, the reduced flight hours, and sees the human result. Men who might be brave, might be intelligent, might be willing, but have not been given the repetitions that make reflexes reliable under stress. A senior aviator, Lieutenant Commander Arai, older, with a scar along his jaw, overhears and steps closer. He speaks without ceremony. "We used to train until landing was instinct," Arai says. "Now they train until they can land once without dying." His eyes sweep the room. "Then we send them to fight the best trained carrier pilots in the world." The words are not complaint. They are an obituary for a system. Matsuoka listens as Arai recounts the battles that led here, not as history, but as personal attrition. The Solomons, where veteran pilots were consumed in constant combat, the long grind over New Guinea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American Hellcats and coordinated fighter direction annihilated Japanese carrier air groups. Leyte, Arai says, was the continuation of that same loss, except now the Navy is trying to fight without its eyes. "When Kurita came through San Bernardino," Arai says, "we had no air cover, none that could stay with the fleet. The Americans knew where we were. Their planes found us again and again." He taps his temple. "A fleet without air cover is blind and naked." A young pilot nearby, perhaps trying to reclaim pride, blurts, "But we still attacked. We flew from the Philippines." Arai looks at him gently, and Matsuoka sees something like grief in the older man's gaze. "Yes, Arai says. You attacked. Many attacked. He pauses. And many did not return. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage cannot replace training, and training cannot happen without fuel and time. The room shifts uncomfortably, as if everyone has felt the truth land inside their ribs. Outside, an aircraft engine coughs and then dies, a mechanic's shouted curse following it. Matsuoka imagines the American carrier decks he has never seen but has heard described, rows of aircraft, crews moving with practice speed, pilots cycling through missions with confidence rooted in training hours and logistical depth. He imagines the Japanese carriers at Cape Engaño, flight decks scarred, air groups thin, icons sent as bait. The contrast is not romantic, it is operational. Arai walks to the chalkboard and erases a number with the side of his hand, leaving a faint smear. We can rebuild airplanes, he says quietly. We cannot rebuild experience quickly. Not now. Matsuoka thinks of the word cohesion from Surigao. Cohesion is not only formations and signals, it is a shared competence in the air, the ability to coordinate fighters, strike aircraft and reconnaissance, to direct intercepts, to maintain tempo. Japan's Navy once had that. Leyte has revealed that it is gone or going, bleeding out through the loss of trained aircrews faster than any school can produce replacements. As the session ends, Kobayashi hands Matsuoka a small roster. Names, ranks, units. Next to some names are notes. Injured, missing, transferred, no aircraft. Matsuoka folds the roster and feels its thinness, its fragility. It weighs almost nothing, yet it represents the heaviest loss of all. Not steel at the bottom of the sea, but the trained human beings who made steel lethal. In the ready room, the surviving pilots sit in silence, and the silence feels like the absence of engines overhead, the absence of protection. A navy without its eyes can still swing its fists, but it will strike air, and every miss will cost blood it cannot spare. November 2nd, 1944. The sea outside Brunei is flat and bright, and the calm feels insulting, like the world has decided to pretend nothing happened. Matsuoka is called into a final conference aboard a surviving battleship, one of the great ones, her deck still bearing the scorch marks of near misses and the gouges of shrapnel. The conference is held beneath the armoured conning tower, where the air is cooler and smells faintly of paint and steel. Here, senior officers speak with the slow gravity of men who know their words will be used to judge decisions that can never be remade. Admiral Kurita himself is not present. He has moved on, swallowed by the machinery of command. But his shadow is everywhere, in every sentence that circles the withdrawal at Samar like a ship circling a minefield. A vice admiral's staff officer, Rear Captain Shibata, stands at the head of the table with a stack of logs. We must establish sequence, Shibata says. Not opinion, sequence. But sequence is opinion when the heart is involved. They go over the hours after San Bernardino, the appearance of the escort carriers, the destroyer torpedo runs, the rain squalls, the air attacks. Shibata reads from signal logs. Orders sent, orders received, signals delayed or misunderstood. The voices in the room remain controlled, but Matsuoka senses the pressure beneath. Every man here understands that this was the closest Japan came to striking the invasion fleet at Leyte, and that the moment passed. A captain with a bandaged hand, Commander Ito, speaks up, unable to keep the edge out of his tone. We had them, he says. Their carriers were small, their screens were thin. If we had pressed through, another officer interrupts, calm but firm. Pressed through to what? He asks. Into Leyte Gulf, under constant air attack, with unknown enemy carriers possibly nearby, with ammunition expenditure already high, with cruisers falling behind. The room murmurs. Ito's bandaged hand clenches. The doctrine, he insists. Kantai Kessen. This was it. Shibata doesn't argue doctrine directly. He argues reality. He points to a fuel chart pinned to the bulkhead. Destroyers reported low fuel, he says. Some cruisers had taken damage. Chokai and Chikuma were being hit. Our formation was breaking. He flips a page. Air attacks continued, not decisive individually, but cumulative. Cumulative. Another word that defines the war now. Not one grand, honorable blow, but the steady accumulation of damage, fatigue, confusion, and loss. Matsuoka watches the debate and feels the tragedy deepen. Both sides are right in different eras. Ito speaks from an older Navy's logic. Push forward, accept losses, deliver the decisive strike. Shibata speaks from the present, where air power makes exposure fatal, where uncertainty about enemy carriers is a paralyzing threat, where fuel constraints turn boldness into a gamble with no reserve. A senior admiral, grey-haired and quiet, finally speaks. We must understand, he says, voice soft, that our fleet is no longer a sword we can swing freely. It is a blade already cracked. Every strike risks shattering it. The words settle like dust. Matsuoka thinks of the pilot's room, the roster's thin paper. A sword needs eyes to guide it. It needs fuel to move it. It needs a scabbard, industry, logistics, training, to preserve it between battles. Japan's fleet has been asked to be decisive without those supports. Shibata resumes, describing the psychological fog off Samar. Reports of enemy carriers, fear of additional attacks, the sense that the Americans might be deliberately drawing them into a trap. Admiral Kurita believed, Shibata says carefully, that if we pressed south, we might lose the remaining heavy units without achieving decisive effect. In the stillness that follows, Matsuoka hears the unspoken admission. The fleet's value had shifted. It was no longer purely a weapon to be spent for victory. It had become, in desperation, a precious remnant to be preserved because there was nothing behind it. No second fleet waiting. No training pipeline capable of recreating what was lost. No fuel surplus to allow another grand sortie. Preservation itself becomes strategy. An ugly strategy, but one forced by scarcity. After the conference breaks, Matsuoka steps out onto the battleship's deck. The steel under his boots feels solid, timeless. But he looks at the sea and sees the echo of San Bernardino, an opening in a defensive ring, a moment when the fleet emerged and the future held its breath. He imagines the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf, the transports, the supply ships, the fragile arteries of an army coming ashore. He imagines Japanese guns firing into that mass, the chaos it could have caused. And then he imagines the retaliation. American carriers striking, submarines closing, the remaining Japanese heavy units running out of fuel with no safe harbor. The moment did not simply slip away. It was priced, weighed, and, under the conditions Leyte exposed, found unaffordable. That is the new brutality. Not whether Japan can fight, but whether Japan can afford to fight in the way it once did. The decisive battle dream required recklessness backed by reserves. Leyte proved the reserves are gone. What remains is courage bleeding into the sea and a fleet that survives only by spending itself more slowly. The aftermath. A navy bleeding out. November 3rd, 1944. Brunei Bay again. The rain returns in the afternoon, warm and heavy, drumming on steel and turning the anchorage into a grey watercolour where ships fade at the edges. Matsuoka stands on a pier watching a damaged cruiser prepare to depart. Lines cast off, engines coughing into life, smoke rising in a dirty column that the wind immediately tears apart. The ship's wake spreads behind her like a scar that won't close. Around him, the machinery of recovery grinds on. Men hauling crates of ammunition that will never be fired in the way they were once imagined. Mechanics wrestling with parts scavenged from one hull to keep another moving. Clerks stamping papers that certify losses as if stamping them makes them manageable. A small group of sailors carries another canvas-wrapped body down the pier toward a waiting launch, their boots splashing in puddles. No one speaks. Even the salutes are quieter now. Matsuoka holds a folder under his arm, his compiled reports, the battle's aftermath made official. Inside are ship lists with names crossed out, pilot rosters with entire sections reduced to blanks, fuel ledgers marked with rationing notes and grim projections. He has written the words catastrophic losses in formal language, but he knows the phrase is too clean. Catastrophic implies an event, a moment. What he has seen these last days is not a single catastrophe, but a hemorrhage, a slow draining of what made the Imperial Japanese Navy a coherent fighting organism. He walks along the pier, listening to the layered sounds, the slap of rain on water, the low thrum of turbines, the occasional shouted order, the distant metallic clang of repairs. In his mind, Leyte Gulf replays not as one battle, but as a chain. Sibuyan's relentless airstrikes that sank Musashi. Surigao's radar-guided night slaughter that shattered Nishimura. Samar's savage, disorienting brawl where small American ships charged and forced caution. Cape Engaño's sacrifice of carriers as bait, and behind all of it, the invisible strangulation of logistics, fuel convoys hunted, training hours cut, replacement pilots rushed, cohesion fraying. None of those pieces alone would have killed the Navy. Together they reveal a truth that is impossible to unsee. Japan's naval power is now being consumed faster than it can be regenerated. Matsuoka pauses near a stack of oil drums stamped with markings that look like promises. A petty officer nearby is arguing with a supply sergeant about allocation. How many drums for this destroyer? How many for that cruiser? Who gets priority? The argument is quiet but desperate, because behind it sits the unspoken knowledge that there isn't enough for everyone. A month ago, such an argument might have been settled by doctrine. Now it is settled by scarcity. Matsuoka thinks of the pilot's room. Men with trembling hands, with fewer carrier landings than they can count on, asked to face an enemy whose carrier air groups operate like a well-oiled machine. He thinks of Arai's words, "We are producing men with wings, not pilots." He watches a small group of aviators walk along the pier in silence, their eyes down, as if avoiding the sight of ships they can no longer properly protect. The Navy, he realizes, is losing not just hardware but identity, the confidence that comes from knowing you can strike, recover, and strike again. The American Navy can do that. Japan's is being forced into a posture of reaction, of desperate sorties planned around dwindling fuel, of decisions shaped by what cannot be replaced. A launch passes close to the pier, its engine sputtering, carrying officers toward another meeting, another set of orders. One of them, an older captain, glances at Matsuoka's folder and gives a tight, weary nod. It is not camaraderie. It is recognition. They are all now custodians of decline, managing a fleet that is still formidable on paper, but hollowing out from within. Matsuoka looks out across the bay, and for a moment he imagines it as it might have been. Carriers with full air groups, destroyers fueled for sustained operations, trained crews rotating through exercises, a doctrine that could still be executed with confidence. But the vision collapses under what he has seen. Leyte did not merely inflict losses, it broke the illusion that the decisive battle could restore Japan's fortunes. The decisive battle happened, and it decided something else, that Japan's navy, even when it fights bravely, is operating on borrowed time and borrowed fuel, bleeding out in the open sea while the enemy grows stronger with every convoy and every carrier deck cycle. The rain intensifies, blurring the far ships into silhouettes. A siren sounds, routine, not urgent, calling men to stations. Matsuoka turns his collar up and begins walking back toward the office, where his reports will be sent onward, toward Tokyo, toward the men who still talk in clean phrases. He knows what his papers will say. Lists, numbers, formal conclusions. But what he has learned cannot be fully written. It is felt in the emptier ready rooms, in the thinner fuel allocations, in the quieter salutes, in the way the fleet survivors look at one another as if counting who will still be there next month. Somewhere beyond the bay, American forces are consolidating on Leyte, building airfields, bringing in supplies, turning their foothold into a grip. Japan's navy will sortie again, because it must, because pride and duty and the emperor demand it. But Matsuoka now understands the brutal truth that Leyte revealed in the aftermath. The navy is no longer fighting to win a decisive battle. It is fighting while it bleeds out, hoping the bleeding slows, even as every day proves it will not.